do something real quick. Came to pass in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. They said to me, the survivors who were left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So this is after the first wave has come back. This is actually well after the first wave has come back. Not everyone has come back. Nehemiah is still in Shushan the citadel. He's still there. Now, who is Nehemiah? And chapter 2 helps with that, because who he is, he's the cupbearer to the king. Chapter 2, verse 1, it came to pass in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. And that he's just a cupbearer to the king. He's not nobility. He's not a prince. He's just a man who cared about God's people. And so he has heard the condition of Jerusalem. And the wall is in ruin, frankly. And so he is going to, if you're familiar with the account, you know what happens. Verse 5, he says, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. And so the king says, how long is your journey going to be? Set him a time. You might notice verse 7, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region as well. Some of those governors, one of them being Sanballat in verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, so this is the governor of Samaria, is who Sanballat is. When they heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. So that's just a little bit of a backdrop of what's going on. So here Nehemiah is from cupbearer to the king, and he's going to be one of the men who's instrumental in the rebuilding, the building of the wall specifically. But along the way, there's going to be obstacles. So that's what we're going to think about tonight. So to look back in chapter 2, verse 11, we get to the first obstacle. Came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me, except the one on which I rode. I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate, viewed the walls of Jerusalem. Right? He's just surveying is what he's doing. He's not telling anyone. He doesn't have just the few with him. He's viewing the walls of Jerusalem that are broken down in verse 13, and the gates that are burned with fire. Went to the fountain gate, the king's pool. There's no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night by the valley, and I viewed the wall, and I turned back and entered the valley gate, and so returned. The officials did not know where I'd gone, what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, nobles, officials, or others who did the work. Right? He's just surveying, just the few with him, basically he on his own. I said to them, you see the distress we are in, how Jerusalem lies in waste. Its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. And so they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. Okay. The walls are in obvious ruin. It is not a clean slate at all. It gets to the point where even the animal that he's on could not pass, whatever animal that was. What's interesting about this is the timeline. And because so much is known about various kings secularly, so whether we're talking about Cyrus or whether we're talking about Artaxerxes or whichever king it is, there's so much that is known about them. When scripture starts saying, like in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, like we just read, we know the year. We can timestamp the events of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Cyrus issues the decree, the captivity will end, at least when the first wave comes back, in 538 BC. So just keep that in mind. 538 BC is when captivity ends, within a year or two. Nehemiah enters the picture around 90 years later, right? Not 9 years, 90 years later in 446 BC. That's when Nehemiah comes on the scene. Now, granted, in those 90 years, things had happened. This is not the first wave. Nehemiah is not the first wave. There's already been a wave that came back. Zerubbabel has already come back, right? Zerubbabel, and you have the building of the temple. We're going to read a passage where we can see the temple has been built. And so that's been built. So Zerubbabel happens in that 90 years. Part of Ezra happens in the 90 years. Esther happened in the 90 years. So everything with Mordecai, right? All of that happened within this 90-year window. One of the prophets that was in Zerubbabel's time, so this precedes Nehemiah, one of the prophets was Haggai. And if you remember in Haggai chapter 1, where it talks about, the Lord says, is it time for you to dwell in your paneled houses and the Lord's house to lie in ruin? And that's where Zerubbabel gets busy building. And that's because of Haggai, one of the prophets, that prompting that came from the Lord. All that's to say this: they had built houses, even the house of God, the temple. It's been built, and yet the wall is still lying in ruin. It's still lying in ruin. Decades have gone by. And so we think about the first issue, the first obstacle that leaders have to deal with. And I would suggest it's this: it's the status quo. It's just the way things are. It's like, why would you be building your houses? And eventually, yes, they finally build the temple. It takes a number of years, but yet the wall's lying in ruin. The gates are lying in ruin. And it's like, why is it this way? Because without walls, what are they? They're just exposed. They're just exposed. There's so little protection. People are able to come and go as they please. There are no gates. And it looks like, as to just think about any town. If the entrances to North Ridgeville took Lily to work about a week ago and turned down Lorraine, and there's a tree across the road. Can you imagine if the workers just left the tree across the road? Can you imagine if all of the entrances, if there was no good way to get in and out of town? And that's what was going on in Jerusalem, that there's just rubble everywhere, to the point where even his horse or even whatever animal he's on, even the animal couldn't pass. It's just rubble. There's just rubble everywhere. He comes in, it's not a blank slate. It's not been cleaned off. It's just rubble. And it had been that way for a long time. It had been that way, frankly, for basically a generation. So that's to say this, that sometimes people just, we make excuses and we say, well, that's just how things are. It's just the status quo. And people accept that. But what I would suggest is that leaders don't accept that. What leaders do is they push against the status quo, because they recognize how things should be. And Nehemiah, he's just a cupbearer for the king, but now he's taking on a different role, and he knows what needs to be done. So he's out surveying, and he's seeing the same thing that everyone else has seen for years. but he speaks to those individuals and he says, listen, we have to build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. So he says, let us rise up and build. And they set their hands to this good work. So that's the first obstacle. Now we need to let's talk about outside forces. We were already introduced to Sanballat in chapter 2. Now, what are those individuals going to do? And to look down in chapter 4, one of the things they're going to do, and I'm going to have to speed this up a little bit. I hope you're familiar with Nehemiah. It's an interesting study. They begin just by mocking them. And they say, oh, if even a fox goes up on it in verse 3, it's going to fall down. So that's the first thing they do. They just mock. They mock the whole idea of it. And they just think there's no way that this is going to work. Nehemiah, he just prays to the Lord and he says, turn their reproach on their own heads. Verse 6, things get cranked up a little bit. They build the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height. When those individuals saw it, when the enemy saw it, they started becoming very angry, and they started conspiring together to come and attack Jerusalem. And so mockery gives way to anger and threats. And with each one of these, what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to react to these things, to these outside forces? If people mock us, how will we react? If people start getting angry and maybe even more than that, how are we going to react? To look further on in the account, we see what Nehemiah does. This is where he positions men along the wall. They have their weapons and they have their shovels as well. He encourages them to fight. You might notice verse 14, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. They needed to understand what was at stake. So as the enemies heard these things, they built on the wall, they carried burdens. And there in verse 17 is where we have, with one hand, they worked construction, and with the other, they had a weapon. And there's been plenty of lessons about that concept as well. To look down a little bit further, one of the things that's going to happen in chapter 6, as it's happening, as the wall's rebuilt, these individuals, they're going to end up, just see the message they send to Nehemiah. Come, verse 2, come let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me harm. Okay, so they send this fake request, basically saying, hey, let's just be friends. But there was an agenda there. Nehemiah doesn't fall for it. He says, I'm doing work. I'm not coming down. But they send the message 4 times, and I answered in the same manner 4 times, verse 4. And then a little bit later in this same account, because what they end up doing, they start reporting that the Jews had planned to rebel, and Nehemiah says, no, verse 8, no such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. They were saying they were going to rebel in verse 6. They were rebuilding the wall so that Nehemiah could be their king, was what the slander was. And Nehemiah says, no, that's not what's going on here. They were trying to make Nehemiah and all the Jews afraid. A little bit further, around verse 10, Nehemiah comes to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel. He was a secret informer. And this secret informer, for the bad guys, by the way, says, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. So you see the temple's done. Let's meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple. They're coming to kill you. Nehemiah says, should a man such as I flee? No. Verse 12, I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. So you put all of that together, and what you have is you have mockery, anger, threats, false friendship, right? Come, let's meet in those plains, and, slander, trickery, all of those things were happening. A little bit later in the account, Nehemiah is going to come back. He's going to be gone for some time, and he's going to come back. And one of these individuals who has been plotting and scheming, the person who was somewhat in charge there in the temple, let me look over, and it's a little later in chapter 13. It was Eliashib the priest, having authority over the storerooms. He was allied with one of these guys. He was allied with Tobiah, and he was letting Tobiah stay in one of the rooms of, it looks like, the temple, I believe. And he'd prepared for him a large room where previously they'd stored the grain offerings, frankincense articles, all those things. And you could probably guess Nehemiah's reaction. Nehemiah kicks him out and gets rid of all this stuff. So what that is speaking about is outsiders within. All that's to say, this list up on the screen, leaders are going to have to deal with all of these outside forces. There will be those who mock. There will be those who get angry. There will be those who try to present friendship, but you better be careful about who your friends are. There will be those who slander, and with each one of these, we have to react in a godly way. We can be overcome by these things, or we can be victorious over these things. All right, so those were the outside forces. There's also going to be internal forces. Back up to chapter 3. And as the building commences, and in chapter 3, you have the list of everybody everything that everyone's doing. And you have people from different occupations, and each one's working. You have people who are working, people who did more, people who did less, probably based on abilities, on resources. You have men, women, I believe there's a mention of children in there as well, but you have all these people working. But then in the midst of all that, notice verse 5, next to them, the Tekoites made repairs, but their nobles did not put their shoulders to the work of the Lord. And that's recorded. And so we might think about internal forces at play and what obstacles leaders will face. One of them is not everybody's going to work. And that's just the sad reality of the situation, that people bury their talents. Sometimes people have faith, but they don't have works. Sometimes people, they appear religious outwardly, but inwardly, they're negligent. That's the reality. And it's, this section in Nehemiah, it's recorded for us to try to learn from, frankly. Chapter 5, another obstacle Nehemiah is going to have to deal with is that, and again, we just don't have time, but in chapter 5, what they were doing was you had brethren who were indenturing themselves to their brethren. So they were effectively becoming each other's slaves. You had some who had money and some who did not. And that's what was happening. You had individuals who were borrowing money for the king's tax. Notice, they were mortgaging. Our sons, our daughters are many. We've mortgaged our lands, and they were starting to starve to death. They'd borrowed money. Verse 5, yet now our flesh is as of the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children. It's not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards. Nicodemus, in dealing with this usury. So you had brethren who were taking advantage of their brethren, is what was happening. Nehemiah becomes very angry when he heard their outcry and these words, and after serious thought, he rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, each of you is exacting usury from his brother. He calls a great assembly against them, and he says, it's got to stop. Verse 9, he says, what you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nation and our enemies? I also, with my brethren and my servants, am lending them money and grain, please let us stop this usury. Rather than lending it to them, charging interest on them, they needed to be helping their brethren and not taking advantage of them. So, internal forces, brethren abusing one another, it happens. And we'll also add, we can be a part of the problem. Nehemiah says, I'm doing this and it's got to stop. And we can easily be a part of the problem. Nehemiah, the passage said, he thought about it seriously, and that's what he had to do. He says, after serious thought, he realized, like, this cannot continue. The remainder of that chapter talks about Nehemiah's generosity, and that he stopped and he commanded that all of this usury stop. And it talks about how he was not going to be a burden, and he did not burden the people going forward. But that was one of the things that had to be dealt with. One of the other things we've already read is that those who are in authority can abuse it. And that's that priest who had that individual staying in one of those rooms. That was a wicked man. And for some reason, Eliashib, the priest, he is allied with him. And Nehemiah kicks him out, like I said. So all of these things that we've looked at, all these things, we'll face the same sort of thing. And it's obstacles that leaders will face. Not everyone's going to work. There will be brethren who abuse other brethren, and we can do the same thing. And those who are in authority can abuse that authority. And it's just something that has to be dealt with. Now, as those things are dealt with, of course, back in the account, we know what happens as they work together and as they overcome these things. Verse 15, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. And it happened when our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God. And Nehemiah saw to it. Nehemiah spearheaded the whole thing, from a cupbearer to the king, to getting the wall rebuilt, securing Jerusalem. One of the other things that I like that Nehemiah does, and he's going to be gone for a time. And in verse 1 of Nehemiah 7 says, so it was when the wall was built, I'd hung the doors, all these things. He says, I gave the charge of Jerusalem to my brother Hanani, and Hananiah, the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. Granted, he's going to come back after he's told the king. Remember, he gave the king a timeline. He said, I'm going to be gone for this long, and then he has to return to the king. But when he comes back to the king, he eventually gets to come back to Jerusalem, and that's where he sees what Eliashib had done with Tobiah. But when he's gone, he puts it into the hands of a faithful man, of those who are faithful, to make sure that even in his absence, that they're going to continue in this good work. If you're familiar with Nehemiah, you know what the rest of Nehemiah happens, because it's the account where Ezra reads from the law in the open square. It's the account where you have Ezra reads the law, the Levites give the meaning, and the people start weeping. And you have all of that happening. So if you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to read it. But in thinking about all those things, and that pretty much brings our study to a close. So if you weren't familiar with that, I hope that, like I said, worthy of further study, or if you hadn't studied it in a while, I hope it served as a good refresher for you, just in thinking about, again, leadership. And Nehemiah is certainly one of those individuals in the Old Testament that he was one of the leaders, of course. So hope it was helpful for you. The question that we are going to be thinking about tonight, I keep pushing the wrong button. We're going to think about the question, why do you think the people had not rebuilt the wall? Still have about 7 or 8 minutes, so feel free to take yourself off mute. And we're going to just think about that question for a few minutes. Why do you think the people had not rebuilt the wall? Like I said, quite a bit of time has gone by. So what's your thinking on that? There are a lot of people there, and it takes Nehemiah coming back and saying, we got to get busy. So why do you think they had not been doing that? Anyone
Maybe,
have any thoughts?
maybe they ran out of money.
Maybe they were able to build their houses, I can tell you that.
I'm thinking that it was just a lack of initiative, that nobody really wanted to be responsible for starting the building of the wall.
Maybe so. And that's, we don't know for sure. We, like I said, that verse in Haggai about, is it time for you to live in your paneled houses? And that was more in reference to the temple. And certainly they did have limited resources. We know that. But yeah, I wonder if Brenda's not right, just a question of initiative, and that it's one thing to build your own house. It's like, well, you need someplace to live. But when it comes to a project for the city, and it's, well, everyone's got to get on the same page and work together. And that takes some organization. Any other thoughts?
Well, it's possible, I guess, that some of the individuals, as you said, they want to take care of themselves and let other people take care of, let somebody else do the work, and I want to take care of me.
Right. And by the way, what's interesting is as they are rebuilding the wall, it talks about it, I think, more than once. Those who lived on the outskirts of the city would build the wall next to their houses. And so it's like, this is your portion, this is your part. And so they would build their parts, some more, some less, but that language is also used. I wonder if, part of it is just they're living their lives.
Yeah.
And it's just, they have their house, they have the house of God. It's like, okay, but Nehemiah's like, this is not good. The city is not secured. What other thoughts do you have? Any other possibilities?
Yeah, John, I was thinking that some of them might have thought that that was a huge undertaking.
Sure.
And, they just didn't have enough gumption to do it.
Yeah, and it was. I mean, you all have been over there, and I mean, it was a huge undertaking. And it was a big project. It's easy to read the passage about it. They got it done, and they got it done in a short time. And I suppose there's a lesson there that big things can be done relatively quickly if people will just learn to work together. And there's probably that lesson there as well. But it was a daunting task, I suppose. You look out and you see the ruin, and it's, okay, where are we going to haul all that to? How are we going to do this? But yeah, it would have been a daunting task.
John, don't you think that Nehemiah stirred up patriotism or the nationalism? Here we're the Jewish people. We need protection, and because as they keep building and threats are coming towards them, they have a sword, they have a weapon.
Right.
But they're building with one hand and a weapon in the other hand. And so for me, that represents a little bit of patriotism. They're out looking for each other as well as themselves.
And Brenda, do you think perhaps that may be one reason they didn't? Because the more they hoist the Jewish flag, so to speak, the more they may have been afraid of somewhat making a name for themselves and drawing attention to themselves, maybe.
That's a possibility, but I think that's subjectivism,
Yeah, I mean, I know that's what the enemies basically say. They're like, oh, you're gonna, you're putting walls up so you can defy the king.
Yeah.
And it's like that wasn't the plan. But yeah, to your point about nationalism, and I mean, when it talks about, you know, the reproach of their enemies, and they didn't want anything good to happen to the Jewish people. But the Jews, obviously, you know, it's like, we're the people of God, and this is the city of peace. And here it is. And we have the temple, we have our houses, but we're open. we are exposed. And so the walls are going to be built. Any other thoughts? We still have about a minute and a half.
John,
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
basically it seems to come down to motivation. Motivation is having a good enough reason to do something. So evidently they didn't have enough there, and they needed a leader in the first place. And also, you know, that guy Geshem the Arab was with Sanballat and Tobiah. Yeah, you know, it just seems a little strange. So there were definitely enemies there, and you know, they seem to want to control things. And well, it just points out the need for good leadership, you know, and to get it done.
And to that point about, and let's close with this thought of stirring people up. I believe Hebrews says, let us not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but we are stirring one another up unto love and good works. And that's what Nehemiah was doing with the people. That's another aspect of leadership, of trying to stir people up to the Lord. So appreciate everyone. Thank you for being on here with me. Those of you who are traveling, I don't see the Daltons on here, but we hope they have safe travels. And Bruce and Brenda, y'all take care on the road. And
Thank
good-
you.
yeah, good to see
Good night.
everyone. Thanks for being on
Have
here,
a good,
everyone.
safe trip, everybody.
Yep, everyone take
Thank
care.
you.